Everybody, Sam White here. I'm an artist, illustrator, and I stream on Twitch. I was thinking about what I could talk about for my next video, and I thought that a general how I paint landscape video might be beneficial to a bunch of you. Um, this will go into like some of my process stuff, and I don't usually talk about that stuff while I'm streaming. But I think this could be a good launching point for other videos that I want to make down the line. Those mainly being drawing from observation and the benefits of keeping sketchbooks and stuff like that. Now, before I begin, I need to say this. This is how I go about painting environments. I'm still learning. I still have problems with my environment paintings. And even a lot of these key elements that I bring up are things that I'm still actively, to this day, working on and trying to improve. It's really important for me to emphasize this, as with everything with art, you don't just want to take one opinion. Research for yourself as well. There are multiple ways to do anything in art. This is my way about going about painting. And as I stated earlier, I'm still learning. And even this one way that I'm going to go about, I have multiple ways of going about environment painting. This tends to be the one that I'm more heavily leaning to now. I feel like it's the smarter choice about going about environment paintings than what I was doing previously. But yeah, let's begin. When I'm working on an environment painting, there's some key elements that I try and keep in mind. So I'm focusing on focal hierarchy, color, camera, and perspective, and the overall story. These are all really important elements to keep in mind when working on an environment painting, but I think they can apply to any painting, really. We'll get into each one of these points as we continue, but first I want to just walk through my general process. The process is really quite simple if you break it down into its basic elements. It's thumbnailing and idea generation, the first pass, gathering reference, a little bit of photo bashing, and then you detail the fuck out of it. With most of my paintings, I never want you to notice that there's photo bashing. The reason I do these photo bashing elements, especially in the early stages, it's for nothing more than getting basically callouts for you to work from. But we'll get into that later. Planning is where we begin, alright? Planning is the most important part of not only environment illustration, but any painting in general. The thumbnail, the idea generation, the first pass, and most importantly, the reference gathering are all important parts of the planning phase. So when you go into a painting, ask yourself some questions. What is the overall story that I'm trying to convey with this painting? And how can I convey it through my focal point, but not just that focal point, the entire scene, okay? The focal point should always draw the eye, right? But everything around it should further emphasize the story and the general idea that you're trying to convey. I'll be the first to admit that a lot of times I tend to lose focus in my sketching of cool thumbnails, and I let the story take backseat. I'm actively trying to remedy this point. Yeah, I'm really bad at just focusing on making a cool painting and not a painting that has an interesting story. But yeah, we all have stuff to work on. So now you have an idea of what you want to paint, or you should. Going by whatever and whatever I hope you do. So you have this story in your head. For the sake of an example, we'll come up with an idea that we can use as like a reference point. Okay. So it's a small fishing village in a mountainous region. The villagers are everyday fishmongers. That's it. That's the basic outline you have, right? Basic story. Ask yourself questions that can help emphasize the story, the place you are visualizing. Close your eyes. What do you see if you're there? What do you smell? smell of fish guts, fishmongers constantly working the docks, doing their daily jobs, bringing in the daily catch, recently arrived ships off the coast, bringing in maybe some giant catches of whales and stuff that they can harvest for their oil and meat and blubber. The wind constantly howling from the fjords, wear and tear along the docks from constant use, maybe some moss developing along some of these rotted away planks that haven't been replaced because it's a poorer village, maybe. Um, so now you have this visual in your head, okay? Now we start thumbnailing. So when you begin your thumbnailing, in whatever medium you want, I tend to split it between thumbnailing in Photoshop and sketchbooks. For my sketchbook sketches, I feel like I can really just hone in on doing something really simple. Just a couple of line strokes to kind of like, okay, well, all right, here's where I want this dock to be. Here's where I want the main focal duder to be. Here's where I want the ship coming in with a giant fish or whatever. So you have those. You can emphasize it with quick little sketches. You're not worrying about making refined sketches. It should never be the point, especially at the early phase. You should be worrying specifically about getting good ideas and a good composition set up. Yeah. So you want to illustrate a composition that not only portrays a good illustration, but that shows the world that you're trying to depict. If you come to a point where you find a thumbnail sketch early on that you like, never stop there. Don't stop at the first sketch that you like. Set out a list for yourself of an amount of thumbnails that you want to paint, right? So say you want to do 50 thumbnails, right? So do 50 little boxes of little sketches, and then once you see one that you like, keep going, because that first one could be your best one, or it also could be the best one of the 20 ones that you're going to do that are going to be amazing. And a lot of times when you come to that first one, that's a little kernel of an idea that you have. Like, oh, well, I really like that idea of like maybe like the camera being over here and it's showing like the dock through like a door opening or some shit like that. Like that one thing could lead to a multitude of other compositions that just kind of like branch off from that one specific one. And each thumbnail can iterate on each other. It's just a place to explore. Don't worry about making the best thing early on. This is all for exploration and idea generation. We'll get to that later stuff. We'll get to that other stuff later where you're going into making tight line sketches. But right now it's just the idea. How can I make this one idea that's overall the story of my painting well captured in this tiny little frame? Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to thumbnailing is the story you set for yourself. Focal hierarchy and camera placement. We already talked about story when it comes to thumbnailing, but to recap, you want to keep your main general prompt in mind and ask yourself questions. Try and find out what you would be able to see, smell, etc. From things around. When it comes to story in environments, a lot of the story comes down to culture, creatures, characters, and things that inhabit the world. For the longest time, I had the goal to show story in an environment without showing the stereotypical walking stick salesman dude, or a random character added to help show a basic story. And I think that's kind of a good idea, right? Because if you can portray an environment without having to resort to using characters and make that singular environment tell a story and be interesting out by itself, you're on your way to making some really good environments. When it comes to focal hierarchy, I think the best way to explain it is every piece of a painting influences the others. I'll use this image from one of my favorite environment painters, Ivan Shishkin. So every single part of this painting right here builds on and influences the others. And you know exactly from looking at this painting where the eye is supposed to go. It's just, it hits right in the middle. That's where the most value shift is. That's where your eye is instantly drawn. And then where does it go from there? Well, maybe it goes to the road that's leading through, and then maybe it goes to these beautifully rendered like little shrubberies that are down here that leads it back into the tree right here. Every part of this image influences and builds on each other. There's a main read, there's secondary reads, and then there's tertiary reads. Like how does your eye flow through the image is the best way I think I can try and break it down. And even that might not be completely right, to be honest. But that's how I always break it down. How does your eye instantly go to something? It should instantly go to the main point of the composition, then the smaller points. Let me see if I can bring up another image by his. I'm not prepared, boys. I didn't bring this one up, but there's a specific painting of some people walking in the woods that also might be good to show. So this is actually like a really bad fucking screenshot of it. But this fucking thing right here, right? You know exactly where your eye is supposed to go, to these dudes down here. But then your eye gets pulled around by the fucking framing of the trees and how the road leads in. God, that's a fucking terrible image of it. Sorry. Right. So that's probably the best way I can explain focal hierarchy if I'm trying to break it down simply. What's the best way to structure your image so it's not too busy? It reads well. Just a general good test of this is to constantly be zooming out. You don't want to be constantly zoomed into specific little pieces of your painting. I see a lot of people do this where they zoom in on tiny little strands of hair or tiny places, like tiny places around the face where they want to make sure it looks perfect. You want to make sure it reads well at a larger size. So if it reads well at a large size, fucking far ass away, where it's basically like a 10 by 10 pixel, it's fucking tiny as fuck, then you know you got a good read because you can kind of make out those forms still, right? Another way to do this is to squint your eyes. Does everything still make sense when you're squinting your eyes? Be critical of everything you're doing while you're painting. Ask yourself questions. Make sure everything's going right. Ask yourself how you can do this part of the painting better. Well, how could I make the eye lead better into the focal point? Well, I guess I could have like some swooping rocks coming down, pushing the eye over here, and then have something over here that kind of pushes the eye back because there's a rock element here. You got the foreground pulling you in, and then pulls you to the focal element. And the focal element already has a bunch of contrast because I put the darkest darks and the lightest lights there. Like, ask yourself questions that can help you determine how you can make the painting even better, okay? And now camera placement. Sometimes it's best to plan out different placements of the camera, or where it could be placed. Again, ask yourself the question, what's the most important part of the painting? What is the main focal point? Is it something ominous? Then maybe a low camera angle or a Dutch angle would help get across that sense of dread and unease. But for example, we are going with a simple fishing village, a simple establishing shot, or even a shot where the camera is more up in the air looking down, could really be interesting. But always try and experiment with different shot setups. This is after all your planning phase, and this is where you get to, plan. Planning now in the early parts of your painting will make everything less stressful. You won't have to constantly fix mistakes and be mad that something's wrong. And I say this as someone who doesn't plan as much as they should, even though I'm trying to make these steps to plan more. You make everything perfect, that you know exactly what you're going into when you go into the value sketch and the color comps. Make it planned. Make sure you have everything down. Um, okay, now we have gone over things to keep in mind while thumbnailing, and you've successfully done a whole bunch of thumbnails. Let's say you have a few that you think are interesting. Now it's time to refine those ones you like. I tend to refine a few of these thumbnails up a little bit more, staying in the line art phase. And then I get to a point where I have to choose from those ones that I liked. So out of the 50 or 60 thumbnails that I did that are all very rough, I'll pick a couple of them, refine them down to a tight line art, and then we'll go into the value comp. And then from that value comp, we'll go into the color comp. And then from the color comp, we'll start basically detailing. So like, so still staying in the line art at this point, I then choose the one to paint. And a lot of my thumbnails kind of tend to work off each other, if that makes sense. So in a lot of my paintings, I'll have bits and pieces from some of the older thumbnails that I liked, that I try and incorporate. A lot of times you will do this as you're thumbnailing. You'll be incorporating bits and pieces of all these other ones into this specific one painting or this specific one thumbnail, and that'll be like your thumbnail that you end up doing. But even in some cases, there's some things that probably made more sense in other ones that you try and drag in, if that makes sense. That's probably very convoluted, but yeah, you kind of like a certain part of something, so you try and put that in there. Now, once I'm reasonably happy with the overall composition of the sketch, I start to do a value sketch and establish where my lights and darks are. Find where your focal point is, and make sure the values aren't competing with other things in the scene. This is very important. Let's say you have a ship coming in to the port in the fishing village painting. It's carrying a whale on its side, and the ship maybe has some villagers all huddled around the docks ready to help unload the massive beast. You don't want the values of the main focal point, the boat and the whale, to be competing with, say, the water, the people, or the docks. But at the same time, you want to make sure that they're being affected by the same lighting. So you want the light to be popping around that focal point, but still make it seem like it's grounded in the same scene. Okay? I guess one way you could do this, say you're having the boat come in through the ship bay, right? So maybe have sunlight peeking through the clouds and casting down light that's going onto the river or the bay, right? And that light is being hit right there, right where your focal point is. And then you can still have dark darks of that ship. Okay? So then you have that very harsh value contrast going on at that focal point. Your eye should be drawn there because you have those harsh value contrasts. Okay, we're almost done with planning, I swear, guys. The last step, rather, with the planning process is reference gathering. Now, reference gathering is simple, but it's very important. You now know what you want done with your overall painting. So you want to gather a giant board of not only things that could inspire you and help shape the thing, but that are relevant to the era of the painting you're going for. Or let's say the area of the environment that you're going for. This is something that I tend to see a lot. People draw rocks as just rocks and don't take into account some of the more interesting rocks. This sounds really dumb. Some of the more interesting rocks that can be located around these areas of the world. Certain areas of the world have distinct rocks and foliage and stuff like that. Like, you want to emphasize those specific types of rocks. uh, yeah. So you want to have that stuff incorporated in your painting. You don't want it to just be, okay, well, here's this. This is a rock, and I think this is a rock because I saw a rock in, like, outside when I went traveling once. So I'm just gonna draw that rock every time I go and paint a rock. Have rocks that make sense in the environment you're creating. So maybe you're doing something that's maybe a desert scene or something. Maybe the rocks are being sand swept, right? So instead of them just being normal rocks that you would see on a mountain, don't draw mountainous rocks in the desert, right? Because the sand constantly sweeps across. It gets windy, sweeps across these rocks, and erodes them in a certain way. So, for example, where's this one? For example, these types of rocks. And these types of rocks can even be found along, as you can see in the background, along like oceans. These porous types of rocks. Have a rock that makes sense in the scene, I guess, is the point I'm trying to get across. Or maybe you're doing some sort of creek. Well, maybe that creek has a red tint to it because of the stuff that's located around the waters. The waters tends to tint that or the mud and grime and the materials that are in the ground around it tend to tint that creek red. So maybe you have something like that where you can have reds popping into this creek instead of just having it be blue, because water tends to be blue in paintings, guys. Like, think about stuff and think about how you can incorporate color into your painting successfully and make it make sense. So I usually go through this where I go through my reference thing and find stuff that would make sense in that scene. For those of you who want to see my reference thing, this is all my references for specifically environments. These are all basically environment references, except for the anatomy one, but don't ignore that one, okay? Alright, so you want to gather your references. You want to make sure that you're building a reference board that makes sense to what you're going to go for. If you have a character in there and she's in a dress, and this dress is around a specific era, you want to gather reference of specific types of garments that were related to that era. If she's a peasant girl, probably don't look up like fucking beautiful dresses. Probably look up like peasant garments from that era. But don't just copy that type of garment onto that character. Never do that. You use it as callouts and like help you get a general idea of what that character, or in the case of the environment, what that environment should look like. I think we'll stop here with the planning phase thing. Maybe we'll continue this in another 6 months when I go on to how I detail paintings and stuff. But this is the general outline of how I successfully plan a painting. And I say successfully when I don't successfully plan paintings. Again, let me end this entire rant with me talking again about how, please don't just take my word for something. I am by no means a great art duder. I'm just someone who kind of knows how to do environments, sort of. And I'm talking about my specific way about going about environment painting. There are tons of different ways to go about environment painting, incorporating 3D fucking, I don't know, fucking I love how there's only one other one I can come up with, but there's tons. All right, don't just take my word for it. Look into stuff for yourself. Experiment with different things. Everybody has their own way about going about painting. No one way is correct. And again, I'm still learning, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. I love you guys. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped some of you. Maybe I'll be back for part 2 soon.